welcome to Sum Shenanigans, a series that's
Welcome
designed
back.
to provide you with tangible teaching tips that you can implement in your classroom. My name is Adam Varnes. I'm a professional learning specialist at CPM. I taught 7 years in the high school classroom, and I'm excited to be here with my amazing co-host.
Hi, I'm Bri. I'm also a professional learning specialist at CPM. And like Adam, I also taught at the high school level for 6 years. And I'm also really excited to be here. So I'm like co-signing everything you said.
There we go. Just ditto, Adam. Sure, ditto.
Yes.
Awesome.
Same.
Let's see. There you go. Alrighty. So this episode of Some Shenanigans, we're going to be talking about assessment. And so it's, I know it can be a very sensitive topic in terms of, at least for me, assessment does feel very personal,
Mhm.
right? Like
Yeah.
it can be very personal about what we grade, how we grade, can sometimes be difficult to talk about. And again, I'm speaking about my personal experience. It's hard for me to get feedback or hear criticism about an assessment I made or something that I am assessing. So we know
Yeah.
it can be kind of a very personal topic. But we, just like we do with the other episodes, we want to try to provide you with some tips and advice that if we were going back into the classroom or talking to our younger selves, what advice and reflections do we have from our time at CPM, but also our time in the classroom as well. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, what are some of those initial thoughts about assessment and things that come to mind?
Oh, well, I agree with you that assessment is a tricky, I'll say it's a loaded topic,
Mm,
right? Because I think that assessment, first of all, it's loaded because um, I think that assessment is very linked to grading,
yep,
and grading is linked to so much more than just our classroom practices, right? It's linked to the systems that are used at our site statewide, and has so many just really tangible consequences, right? So it just feels very real. And so, yeah, it's tricky. And there's just also so much to consider. So, and so many situational aspects too, right? So you can say, like, this is what's worked well in my classroom. And someone might say, that might, that might not be as easy in my situation and vice versa. So there's a lot to think about when it comes to assessment. I know me personally, I always, I have so much to learn about assessment
yeah,
and so much to learn. Like, I know one area for me, like, I've really been thinking about is how equitable were some of the assessments that I gave,
yep,
right? Which is also just a big thing to think about. So, um, I agree with you. Assessment can be loaded, but I still think that there are things that we can think about in our everyday to make small shifts to improve our assessment practices. And it doesn't have to be super, super scary. So I'm excited to share some tips that we thought about to just support everyday assessment.
yeah.
So
And I think's like almost that caveat that we should place is, of course, well, I shouldn't say every, a lot of schools, even some districts have certain policies in place about grading and things that you have to kind of the rules you have to play by. So we want to encourage you, we're not telling, none of our tips, I think, are going to be to go rogue and do your own thing and forget what your site or your district is telling you. So, but again, just like with our other episodes, we want to try to provide you with some advice that if you can't take, exactly as is and apply, maybe it sparks an idea in you, in this case for assessment. So, if we can get you to think about assessment, even just think about it differently rather than just going and implementing exactly what Bri or I or, are the tips that we're providing, we hope that that works for you as well. Um, I'm going to go ahead and kick this one off.
yeah,
And
please.
so when I was thinking about assessment, you mentioned it earlier, how it's very tied to grading. And it's interesting that you pointed out because my first piece of advice when it comes to assessment, and this might be a little bit deep, but I think it's super important for teachers to determine what is your grading philosophy. And I really feel
Mm,
like without that foundation, it's hard to talk about assessment or think about what assessments should look like because assessments should reflect what your philosophy about a student's grade is. So,
Okay.
speaking
Oh.
about my experience and using my thinking as an example, for me, I wanted a student's grade to represent their proficiency, their mastery of the California state math standards. So, with that as kind of my philosophy behind what that grade, what the student's grade should represent, that kind of focused on, allowed me to focus in on, well, what should my assessments look like if that is my philosophy? So
Mm,
I might give a team test, but if I want the grade to represent individual mastery, well, then it doesn't make sense for me to count that toward a student's grade. So I might give the team test for, student edification, for team to grow the team, right? Not just as like a classroom community, but also to kind of work on that mathematical knowledge together. But at the end of the day, the assessments that I were given and assessments that were grading to count for their grades were all
mhm,
individual based. But again,
mm,
it all tied back to my philosophy. And so I'm not advocating for a particular philosophy. I'm just simply sharing out what mine was. But as you think about your assessments and how to assess students, I think it really comes down to your philosophy. What does that grade represent? Because that will kind of set the foundation for what your assessments, what type of assessments you're going to give, how often, and those sorts of things. So again, I know it's pretty deep, but for me, it's kind of a foundational question that teachers need to consider about assessment.
I think that that makes a lot of sense because even like if I think about, as we create our assessments, if I put a question on a test, it's because I as the teacher think it's valuable,
Hmm.
right? And I think that so that's tied to what my belief about, what is valuable to assess them on, right? Even, go a little further, how I ask that question goes back to, my philosophy um, on maybe what I should assess, how students learn, what's important, right? A big like an example, like if I asked a question like as a multiple choice question versus an open-ended question, right? Even how we ask those questions really uh, I think captures how we, what we value. So I think understanding your philosophy is key. So I have a question for you. So suppose I want to reflect more on my philosophy regarding assessment and what I believe and maybe why I create assessments the way I do. I'm
Hmm.
curious, what are some things that you found that are helpful to kind of learn more about your own beliefs about assessment?
It's a really good question. So I think when I think back to why my philosophy was what it was, is it really came down to like, well, when a student gets a grade, right? Again, what does it represent? What
Hmm.
do I want it to represent? And then how do I reinforce that with my assessments? And for me, it really came down to just trying to learn as much as I could about assessments, like in
Hmm.
all different types. So what different types of formative assessments are there? How often, have teachers tried to give formative assessments? Then we move into summative, right? When we do summative, what do we include? What do we not include? What types of questions? So for me, there was definitely a period of time where I was just like a sponge to everything assessment, going to
Hmm.
conferences, finding all the assessment sessions, finding books and reading through, having lots of dialogue and discussions with my colleagues about assessments, what they look like, what are our goals, right? And that's one thing that we would talk about too when we would put a chapter assessment together is, okay, once what is our goal for this? What do we want to assess, right? And why
Yeah.
do we feel like it's appropriate? So,
Hmm.
I guess if you're a teacher and you're trying to consider, what is your philosophy and kind of really delve deep into that, I would just really encourage you to do some assessment research, talk to colleagues, try to talk to teachers that are not within your department, right? Attend sessions, ask a lot of questions, reach out to us, at
Yeah.
CPM. We'd be happy to talk about that, but it's just really about kind of gathering information. And then from there, I can weed out, okay, this is what I appreciate. I like this idea, but it doesn't work for me, right? Things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, put yourself in those spaces where you're hearing different perspectives, where you're simply listening and just gathering information. that I think gives you the opportunity to then reflect, like, okay, what's resonating, what isn't, and then what does this look like in my classroom too? Because I think I wonder too. That makes me think, if I went back and I looked at one of the assessments I gave, like, one, would I still agree with it, or how have my beliefs about assessment changed? So I think you can get a lot out of just looking at your own assessments, and seeing what kind of questions you ask students, how you ask them can also, um, that would, I think, would also shed some light on our own philosophy. So I think that's a really good thing to always tie back to. What is your philosophy? What are you asking? Why are you asking that? So
Right.
awesome.
And
Uh,
I also feel like, as teachers, sometimes we do things because we do something in the classroom, right? As a teacher, because that's how we experienced it as the student.
yeah.
So we give
Mhm.
chapter tests because we had chapter tests when we were students.
Right.
When that may not fit, right, with your with your grading philosophy, right? It may be that you need to revise that or things like that. So it's just like, like we talked about, just soak up information, hear differing perspectives on assessment, and then from there start to, build out what your philosophy is. And then that's reinforced through the assessments that you design and facilitate. So that would be my
Absolutely.
first one, but I'm interested to hear some of your thoughts on assessment and kind of what would be a tip that you would give to teachers.
Yeah. You got me thinking a lot there. And something you said about, you talked about just the different types of assessment: formative assessment, summative assessment. What does it mean to assess? And it got me thinking about, when I first started teaching, um, what I thought about formative assessment. So my tip has to do with formative assessment. And when I first started teaching, my thought about formative assessment, like, formative assessment equaled exit pass. Like, that was sort of what I saw formative assessment was. And a lot of times, when it came to exit passes, I thought exit pass means I have to grade it. Right. So using the transitive property, that means formative assessment means, like, has to be graded,
Yep.
right? And so what I've started to learn, after going to conference sessions, reading more, is that assessment is not something that always needs to be graded, especially formative assessment. Like, what I've learned is that formative assessment is meant to be informative for both teachers and students, right? So for a teacher, that means, as I'm circulating, I'm I'm doing it to learn what my students know. And I'm interacting with them to provide them with actionable feedback,
Yep.
right? So it's something that's helpful for both teachers and students. So my tip would be to use everyday interactions as formative assessment. Like, that is where your formative assessment begins. Um, and so your classroom, as you are circulating, it provides you so many powerful assessment opportunities. So as students are working in their teams and they're talking, my tip would be to be intentional about your circulation and your observations. So as you're circulating, a couple questions that you might ask yourself, what strategies or representations am I seeing across teams? Um, as they're working, are there any problems that might double as sort of an informal check for mastery, right? Maybe they turn that in and, like, you're not grading it, but maybe you can, collect something a little more concrete. Or maybe, how can I highlight and share, like, some strong student thinking with the class, like, based on what I'm seeing, right? So now you're sort of assessing in real time versus, waiting for that exit pass. So again, capitalizing on what you notice in the classroom, like, allows you to still provide that feedback, and then also do away with the grading.
Yeah.
So formative assessment starts with your observation. That is
Well,
my
yeah,
tip.
you're triggering a lot of memories from early Adam as a teacher when it was
Uh,
that exact mindset, right? Like, oh, uh, how are you going to, when the admin comes, how are you going to end this lesson? What are you going to close it? An exit ticket? Okay, great. What are you doing tomorrow? Another exit ticket? I'm
Yeah.
just
And I'm going to spend all
exhibiting all
night
the things.
grading it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then it
Yeah.
became, well, what else do I do with this information? Right. Now that I know. Um, so yeah, it brings back those memories and those feelings of, oh, the exit ticket was your fallback. Right. And I think for
Mhm.
me, I forget where exactly I heard it from, but the revelation to me that it was when, well, especially in the CPM classroom, you are always doing formative assessment. There's always
Yeah.
formative assessment going on. You're circulating, you're asking questions, you're listening to conversation, you're seeing students on their BNPSs, and you're analyzing that work. So yeah, in a way, you're always doing formative assessment. Um, that doesn't mean it has to be graded, right?
Right.
So yeah, I
Right.
I can very much appreciate that tip.
I think it's something, I think it's really common. I think it's, and I think it has to do with the fact that, as we talked about before, like assessment is naturally linked with grading. And even at CPM, when we do learning events and we talk to teachers about assessments, there are a lot of questions about grading, and we try to be really mindful about um, sort of our support there because um, grading is different. At different sites, there's different systems, there's different, things to consider. We always try to be mindful of just supporting that idea that assessment is one thing, grading is another. They are linked, but they don't always, you don't always have to grade an assessment. Um, but this reminds me actually of something that an old advisor from my credential program mentioned, and it's always stuck with me. So shout out to Dr. Matt Wallace at UC Davis. But in the case that you do grade something, he would always say, if you're gonna spend time grading something, you got to give your students time to do something with it.
Mm.
Right. So, in other words, like, I mean, how many times have you spent like all night grading something? And really, what he said was, if you're going to provide feedback. So how many times have you spent time like writing feedback on a test, and like you probably end up like spending 10 minutes per test, and then you hand it out to students and they take it and you just watch them throw it in the trash
Oh my
after
gosh.
they walk out, right?
I was smiling
uh,
at you because I figured that's where you were going. And it was, yes, very frustrating.
yeah. So have them do something with that. Like have them, spend time in class reflecting on that feedback. And maybe your feedback is actionable. Like very specific actionable feedback, I think is like some of the wisest feedback that we can give. So providing students something to do, something to think about, something to talk about, I think is really important when you do provide feedback and grading. So
And
yeah.
when you say like do something with the feedback, we're talking
Yeah.
more than just like test corrections, right?
I would say so. I think that is something they can do with feedback, but
Mm.
um, maybe you're spending time going over your test,
Yeah.
right? And maybe it's not just going over the answers, but maybe you're providing, maybe for the same problem, like you provide similar feedback around the room that gets at a common misconception, and students have an opportunity to discuss a specific question, a follow-up question or a reflection question about that problem, so that they're all benefiting from it. Maybe you're providing some like error analysis. I'm kind of thinking of whole class examples
Yeah.
um, to help students reflect on what they did on that test and what they would need to do to adjust, to correct, and fix that misconception. So those are a couple examples, but like you said, test corrections is also a great independent example that those could also be done in a team, reflecting on what your mistakes were, maybe how you fixed them, maybe how um, your however you approach the problem is similar to another student's, how it's different. Um, but anytime you can get students thinking about their learning on a test, I think that becomes more powerful. And I actually think that that connects to my next tip. Um, if I can just jump into it, if that's okay.
Yeah. Go for it.
Um, So my next tip was going to be to provide some opportunities for self-reflection.
Mm.
Um, and so this comes from the idea of, as I mentioned a second ago, assessment sometimes feeling like something that is done to you as a student, right? It seems like, "Oh, I've got a test coming up." Um, like I would go into tests just nervous about everything I didn't know, right? And it kind of almost felt like a gotcha moment.
Yep.
Um, and But when you think about what is the purpose, and I'm kind of talking about summative assessment, I've sort of shifted into um, thinking about that big chapter test. It is still an opportunity for teachers and students to pause and reflect on where they're at, right? Versus like just getting a grade and we're one and done. Like, what's what's the point of that for a student? Right? Like versus like, here's my grade and, what can I do with this information now? So I think um providing opportunities for students to reflect like where they're at going into a test is helpful. Like at certain points in the chapter, maybe you're breaking up the chapter, you're giving students a chance to zoom out and look at different topics. How do I feel about this? Where do I feel comfortable? Where do I need to go seek support?
Yeah.
Um, and even after the test, having students reflect on where they showed understanding and again where they didn't. And I want to give one specific tip of how a colleague of mine, this came from Susan Hoffmeyer, who is an awesome veteran teacher in Auburn, California. But one of the things that she would always add to the end of her test is her summative assessment is there would always be a question that said, "Is there something that you did understand that wasn't on the test? Like, explain it to me."
Yeah.
I just love that question because I feel like it shifts this idea of assessment being something done to you to like, no, this experience is about what I do know and about my progress. And then afterward, we can still look at my progress and see where we can go from there. So I love that question. If I were back in the classroom, I would add that to every single one of my tests.
When
So,
what I like about that piece of advice for assessment, right? That self-reflection piece is also it moves the conversation away from being about accumulating points, right? Which I
mhm,
feel like, and I'm guilty of this, right? I would do test corrections so that students could earn back some points, but then that's what the conversation was about. Okay, Mr. Varnes, like, I was this many points away from getting a passing grade. How, what do I have to do to get that many points?
yeah.
And, it felt very like surface level. Once
Hmm.
I switched, I did a version of standard based grading. And so once I switched over to that and a lot of, but also provided time for students to reflect, did those things like error analysis or like a compare or something like that with, to provide that time for reflection. I did notice that students were asking different questions after the exam. Became less about how many points do I need and it shifted more to, oh, Mr. Barnes, what do I need to know for this next test? Right. And so it became about like, what knowledge do I need or what learning do I need to improve on or work on for the next assessment instead of, just again, accumulating those points.
Yeah, I love that. Like, as students in like our American schooling system, I think many schooling systems, like we're taught from a young age about grading, about marks, about being tested on things. And so I think that anything we can do to, like you said, start shifting the conversation um, to help disrupt that messaging in our students' heads it is always helpful. So
Yes. Cool.
yeah.
Well,
All right. You got a tip for us, Adam?
I got one more. Earlier,
Okay.
when you were talking about formative assessment, and you kind of, we talked about not grading all the things, right? And that's really what my
Hmm.
second tip is you can't grade all the things. And
Yes.
so it kind of applies in my mind to two things. Number one, um, all the assessments, right? You mentioned formative assessment. Like it's in my opinion, the capacity for most teachers is just not there to be able to always give these paper or gradable formative assessments and then be expected to um, not only grade them, but provide them with feedback and do it in a timely manner, right? It's just not
Yeah.
typically in our capacity to do that. So I just want to remind teachers, right? You can't grade all the things, or you shouldn't try to grade all the things, not just formative assessments, but also my mind also went to the content, right? A lot of times I've been in classrooms, unfortunately, and I've looked at assessments. They're just too long, right? And
Hmm.
so, teachers are giving 2 page, and that this was like the biggest pet peeve. And I swore on everything, I would never ever give a 2 page test, because there's something about having to flip over a stapled page and know like, oh, I graded one whole page. Oh, there's a second one there. You're still not done, right? It was just one of the most deflating feelings as a grading tests as a teacher. So I kept all my tests to 1 page front and back. Typically, the
Hmm.
format that we would use at the school I taught at was, the front side was what we called formative, and that was only questions made up of content from the chapter we just finished. So let's say
Okay.
we just finished chapter 6, there would be one whole side of the test that was only on chapter 6 material. It was more
Hmm.
formative because we had just finished. They haven't really had time to fully master those topics, right? They haven't had enough
Right.
time. So we knew, okay, once we get into chapter 7, they're going to see that content again. This is just a formative kind of check in on this material.
Hmm.
Other side, we that was our summative side. So that would be any chapter prior to, in this example, prior to chapter 6. So anything from 2 to 5, right? Because chapter 1 is our kind of opening introduction paragraph, or sorry, chapter. So anything from chapters 2 through 5, that those were all fair game. Any topics to go on that. And really, what it does is it gives us, it narrows our focus, right, on what we can. We're not going to
Hmm.
every single thing, but even from there, right, like, okay, I can't. I'm trying to keep it to 3, maybe 4 problems max. I can't ask all the topics, so I'm going to pick some
Right.
topics that I'm going to ask on this test, and I'm going to save ones that I wanted to ask about. I'm going to save it for the next assessment. And so, I think as teachers, sometimes we just try to fit, well, we talked about it in class. They should know it. I'm going to throw it on the assessment. And it just creates these overwhelming tests, and students want to come in for lunch or stay after class. And there's all these logistical things. So just
Yeah.
remember, as teachers, we can't assess all the things all the time. So,
Right. I feel like your tip is twofold there. So I appreciated that little bonus tip because you started off by saying you can't grade everything, right? So keep that in mind, but also you can't assess everything.
mm,
We have to be mindful that our assessments are meaningful, which means they need to be, focused, and not cover all of the things, which is actually one of the things I love about CPMs, just the design of it. Is CPM, one of our pillars is mixed spaced practice, which really, in essence, means that we believe in mastery over time, and that students really need not be assessed on everything, like anything that they haven't had ample time to sit and learn, right? Learning takes time. And that's one of the ways that one of the ways that CPM honors that is by providing a suggested assessment guide. And they might say, hey, this was in chapter 4, you're testing on chapter 4, and exponential equations were in chapter 4, but hey, like they were only in the last 3 lessons. So maybe wait till your chapter 5 test to assess that. So,
right. Yeah.
um, yeah. So awesome. Love that little bonus tip. But I think we're getting towards the end of our time here, Adam. So I just want to summarize some of these assessment tips, and we talked a lot. I think this episode, I think, had a lot of range because assessment has a lot of range, right?
Yeah.
Adam, you started us off by reminding us of the importance of knowing your philosophy around assessment and almost taking time, I think, to um, check that your assessments sort of line up with your philosophy. Um, and I'm going to add on that, like sort of checking in on this often, I think is an important thing. We also talked about the sort of importance of understanding that formative assessment does not need to be graded. And also, it starts in the classroom, it starts with those everyday interactions. So, use those interactions as formative assessment. Invite your students in, provide them opportunities for self reflection, That is important. Assessment's not something that needs to be done to them, but it's a process they should be a part of and really have a front seat in, right? And then lastly, Adam, you reminded us of the importance of not grading everything. We don't have time. Um, Students aren't going to do much with it if you're grading everything. And then also being mindful of what you're assessing. We can't assess everything. So, a lot to think about there. A
That's
lot
a
to
lot
think
to chew
about
on.
there.
Yep.
Yeah. So we hope something resonated with you. We would love to hear your thoughts. I think we were really transparent about this being something that we feel like we have a lot to learn about. And then I think a lot of teachers feel that, and then are also, like you said, really passionate about assessment and learning more and sharing. So please be sure to share any thoughts, ideas, questions you have in the comments. And as always, we'd love for you to continue engaging. And we want to build up this community. So please hit that subscribe button. Follow us on Instagram for more bite sized version of this conversation. And we'll see you next time. Adam, I'm excited for the next episode. I'm not sure what we're talking about yet, but
Yeah, we'll figure it
but
out.
so anyways, take care everyone. We'll see you later.
See you on the next one.